Recently, an event in which I was embroiled in 2021 and which made international headlines at the time was again thrust into the media spotlight. Some of you may recall that I was leading an international research project team applying for funding from the Australian Research Council's Discovery Program to investigate the role of 16th century climate in Britain on the rise of the playhouse industry. And the project was recommended for funding along with 592 others, following a lengthy assessment of the merits of the application. Yet on Christmas Eve 2021, Acting Minister for Education Stuart Robert announced that he was overruling the Research Council recommendations on 6 projects, with Playing Conditions, How Climate Shaped the Elizabethan Theatre, among those vetoed. Robert's announcement triggered a storm of media attention, and one of my tweets made for a delightful screen grab in news stories across the planet. Unsurprisingly, I became a target for vitriol from keyboard warriors objecting to this work as a waste of taxpayers' money. Moreover, the project was named in Parliament as being particularly egregious, bordering on accusations of fraudulence. Now, although the team tried again for funding, it was clear the veto and the ensuing media storm did in effect kill this project. It was finally shelved a couple of years ago. It was thus quite a surprise to me only a few weeks ago to arrive at work to find in my inbox and socials a flurry of messages from colleagues telling me that the project was in the news again. In a story about a potential new plan for the Australian government to stamp out anti-Semitic activity in universities, the ARC veto was mentioned in seemingly unrelated fashion, as an example of government interference in research funding. It seems the Playing Condition project has become the poster child for journalists wanting to write about conservatism in the tertiary sector in Australia. Yet it would be too easy to characterise the veto and subsequent media attention as typical only of climate change deniers on the conservative side of the Australian political and cultural spectrum. The fact remains that research into climate history, in Australia at least, is viewed by many on the political and social left, including academics in the humanities, as suitable only for scientists. In years when the Playing Conditions project was pitched to the ARC but not recommended for funding, there were regular criticisms from assessors within English literature that the project lacked credibility if it did not also include a climate scientist in the main project team. This was despite the fact that Jörg Lutewacker, the chief scientist with the World Meteorological Organization and a noted author of historical climate reconstructions, endorsed the project and agreed to act as consultant where needed. One assessor went so far as to say that the only thing English literature scholars should concern themselves with was the words of Shakespeare to better understand the climate of his time through his genius. Yes, somebody wrote that on an ARC assessment. Mind you, this is not a position that I think can or should be ignored altogether. Now, I'm not going to insist that we shouldn't try to understand how Shakespeare and his contemporaries represented weather phenomena, since, as many scholars have shown in the past 2 decades, there is much of value to be gained from doing this very activity as a contribution to a range of different approaches to early modern drama, either new historicist or eco-critical, for example. Indeed, many of the speakers at this Globe for Globe gathering have been among the most articulate exponents of such approaches. What I do insist, however, is that reading the plays for representations of weather is not the only thing that English literature scholars could or should focus on doing. I would argue in any case that this is not the only thing that existing scholarship in this vein does already. I also maintain that those of us trained in the various branches of history that inform historicist approaches to early English drama, cultural, literary, materialist, and theatre historians, have an obligation to document as fully and faithfully as possible the real-world phenomena that playwrights transform through their representations, and this is an ongoing project. When it comes to studies of climate and weather, The term that has gained ascendancy in recent years is the Little Ice Age. And I confess my own interest in this period category was sparked by a theatre history conundrum. Why was it that during a period that scientists had identified as being characterized by drops in temperature of up to 2 degrees across the Northern Hemisphere, an entire industry emerged in England centered on the great cultural innovation of the age, the open-air polygonal playhouses? Now, the science on this little ice age is indisputable, given abundant evidence of increases in glacial spread across the European and North American continents, with its peak from the 1560s to 1630s, when glaciers were observed for the only time in recorded history, extending to the southern edges of the Swiss valley of Grindelwald, which is why this period has been labelled the Grindelwald fluctuation. This is significant for Shakespeare studies since the period from the 1560s to the 1630s also coincides neatly with the so-called Golden Age of English theatre. This didn't seem to make sense, and I wanted it to make sense. So I formulated the Playing Conditions Project with Elizabeth Tavares in 2017, and other members have joined the team along the way. The goal was to attempt to identify more specific pressure points or tipping points that might account for the rise of the open-air playhouses during a period of extreme cold. Although we never did secure funding from the Australian sector, I did spend a fruitful interval at the Folger Shakespeare Library in 2019 as a short-term fellow, gathering masses of data that could help to solve this conundrum, given the time to collate the data and match it to several case studies of playhouse innovation. In the end, that additional time was never forthcoming, so the work goes on slowly, sporadically, amid the hurly-burly of academic careers. What I can say is that when it comes to the British Isles, the science is actually far from complete. Since most of the evidence for widespread cooling is based on dendrochronology, tree rings, and ice core samples, Britain has long represented a gap due to the relative lack of deep ice and a painful silence from the tree ring record due to the period of deforestation that took place in Tudor England from the 14th to the 16th centuries. The science must therefore be corroborated or gaps filled in through proxy data from the documentary as well as the natural record. Instead of literature scholars keeping in our own lane, then it is our obligation to also furnish the record with textual evidence of climate and weather in the past. Now, as a postscript, I shall briefly attention the climate picture that is, as a postscript, I shall briefly mention the climate picture that is slowly, sporadically emerging from the research. My data is now being entered into the English weather database, courtesy of Madeline Bassnett and the team at Western Ontario, and this data is starting to be used in publications. The conclusion I am willing to pronounce, summarising the collation of records to date, is that while the European mainland communities did experience protracted periods of extreme cold throughout the Little Ice Age, England was situated in a small pocket of warm instability, most likely caused by changes to the North Atlantic current, for most of the 16th century. William Andrews had documented the lack of cold spells in 16th century Britain more than a century ago, but it is a study that has been largely drowned out by Little Ice Age mania. The most visible example of English extreme cold in this period is the Thames frost fairs, but there is a tendency in studies of Shakespeare's England in the Little Ice Age to project back as if there were regular occurrences of this kind in his younger years. The fact is that the first of these frost fairs was in 1608, around the time that England did undergo a significant cold period. In the 16th century, the picture is more unstable, with alternating periods of storm surges, such as in the year of the Armada, 1588, and extreme heat, as in the year of Richard's Winter of Our Discontent, 1592, when in fact a heat wave dried up the Thames for 3 days at one point. To conclude then, the Little Ice Age should remain a hot topic indeed, as more proxy evidence comes to light. Thank you.